Paul McCartney stands as one of music's most beloved figures, a man whose songs have touched millions of hearts across generations. Behind his warm smile and optimistic public persona, however, lies a complex story of deep personal wounds that have never fully healed. For over 60 years, McCartney has carefully maintained his image as the cheerful Beatle, the peacemaker, the eternal optimist. Yet those closest to him know a different truth about the man who helped create the soundtrack to the 20th century. The reality is that McCartney carries with him a collection of painful memories and unresolved grievances that have shaped both his character and his music. These aren't petty disagreements or momentary conflicts, but profound betrayals that cut to the very core of his identity as an artist and human being. Understanding these relationships and the pain they caused reveals a more complete picture of one of music's greatest talents. The Michael Jackson betrayal. When friendship turned to business, perhaps no betrayal wounded Paul McCartney as deeply as that of Michael Jackson, a man he considered not just a collaborator but a genuine friend. Their relationship began in the early 1980s when Jackson was a rising star and McCartney was already an established legend. Despite their age difference, they formed what seemed to be a genuine bond, recording hit songs together and spending time discussing the music industry. During one of their conversations, McCartney shared what he thought was valuable advice between friends. He explained the importance of owning song publishing rights, describing how he had learned this lesson the hard way after losing control of his own Beatles compositions. McCartney even proudly discussed his strategy of buying up other artists' song catalogs as investments. He believed he was mentoring a younger artist, sharing the wisdom he had gained through years of experience in the music business. What McCartney didn't realize was that Jackson was carefully taking notes, not as a friend learning from a mentor, but as a businessman identifying an opportunity. In 1985, when ATV Music, the company that owned the publishing rights to most of the Beatles' songs, went up for sale, Jackson moved swiftly and decisively. He purchased the entire catalog for $47.5 million, acquiring the rights to classics like Yesterday, Hey Jude, and Let It Be. The betrayal was particularly painful because McCartney had no idea the catalog was even available for purchase. He learned about Jackson's acquisition after the fact, discovering that the person he had trusted with industry secrets had used that knowledge to buy his life's work. These weren't just valuable assets to McCartney, they were his musical children, the songs that had made him who he was. When McCartney confronted Jackson about the purchase, the response was cold and purely business-focused. Jackson reportedly told him it was just business, nothing personal. For McCartney, however, it was deeply personal. Every time one of his Beatles songs played in a commercial or movie, every time Yesterday was performed somewhere in the world, the royalties went not to the song's creator, but to Michael Jackson. The situation became even more painful when McCartney made several attempts over the years to buy back his songs. Jackson not only refused but made matters worse by selling a 50% stake in the catalog to Sony Music, effectively turning Paul's musical heritage into a corporate asset. The final insult came when Jackson publicly suggested that McCartney should simply get over it and write new songs, since he was so talented at creating music. This betrayal fundamentally changed McCartney's view of the music industry and human relationships. Until Jackson's death in 2009, the man who had been like a younger brother owned the soundtrack to Paul's youth. While McCartney maintained public politeness, those close to him say the wound never healed, serving as a permanent reminder that even the closest friendships could be sacrificed for business interests. The Lennon conflict. When creative partners became enemies, the relationship between John Lennon and Paul McCartney was one of the most celebrated creative partnerships in music history. Their names linked forever with a hyphen, they created songs that defined a generation and changed popular music forever. Behind the public image of perfect harmony, however, their relationship was far more complicated and ultimately painful than most people realized. The tensions between Lennon and McCartney had been building for years before the Beatles' breakup. By the late 1960s, their artistic visions were moving in dramatically different directions. McCartney embraced melody and optimism, while Lennon sought radical experimentation and brutal honesty. Paul wanted the band to continue performing live, while John was more interested in exploring avant-garde art with Yoko Ono. When the Beatles' beloved manager Brian Epstein died suddenly in 1967, the band lost its stabilizing force. McCartney tried to step up as the unofficial leader, encouraging the group to continue creating and pushing for ambitious projects. His bandmates, particularly Lennon, began to resent what they saw as Paul's controlling behavior. The democratic process that had once characterized the Beatles began to break down. The breaking point came when McCartney made the difficult decision to sue his own bandmates in December 1970. While his legal action was actually aimed at freeing the Beatles from their manager Alan Klein, whom Paul had distrusted from the beginning, the lawsuit appeared to the public and to his former friends as an act of betrayal. McCartney was portrayed as the man who killed the Beatles. Lennon's response was swift and devastating. In 1971, he released How Do You Sleep on his Imagine album, a song so vicious in its attack on McCartney that even hardened music critics were shocked. The lyrics weren't just criticizing Paul's music, they were attempting to destroy his legacy and his self-worth. For McCartney, this wasn't just a song, it was public humiliation from the person who knew him better than anyone else in the world. The man who had once been his creative other half was now using their intimate knowledge of each other as ammunition. Every line was designed to hurt, and according to McCartney, it succeeded completely. While Paul responded with subtle references in his own songs, he never matched Lennon's viciousness. The wound ran too deep for that kind of retaliation. Their relationship remained strained throughout the 1970s, with occasional phone calls that hinted at the possibility of reconciliation, but never reached completion. Then, on December 8, 1980, Mark David Chapman murdered John Lennon outside his New York apartment. When reporters caught McCartney leaving a recording studio and asked for his reaction, a shell-shocked Paul could only mutter that it was a drag. Those 3 words, spoken by a man in trauma who was unable to process his complex emotions on camera, haunted him for years as critics accused him of callousness. The truth was far more complicated. John's death didn't just take away a former friend, it permanently severed any chance of healing their relationship. According to those close to both men, Lennon and McCartney had recently begun speaking on the phone again in the weeks before the murder, and there had even been talk of possibly working together once more. For decades afterward, Paul carefully navigated John's memory in public, praising his talent and acknowledging their partnership while maintaining the Beatles' mythology. But privately, the wound of their unresolved conflict continued to fester, not just because of the harsh words they had exchanged, but because death had stolen any possibility of resolution. The Yoko factor, the woman who changed everything. Before 1968, the Beatles' recording studio was a sacred space where the 4 young men from Liverpool created their musical magic in relative privacy. Then John Lennon brought Yoko Ono to sit beside him during recording sessions, and everything changed. For Paul McCartney, a perfectionist who approached recording with disciplined professionalism, Yoko's constant presence was more than just an annoyance. It was a violation of everything the band had stood for. What bothered McCartney most wasn't simply that Yoko was there, but how dramatically John changed when she was around. The creative partner who had once bounced ideas back and forth with Paul for hours now deferred to Yoko's opinions. The Beatles' democratic process, already under strain, crumbled completely as John and Yoko increasingly functioned as a unit of 2 within the band of 4. McCartney later admitted that he didn't resent Yoko for being with John, but he hated how everything changed once she appeared. As the Beatles disintegrated, Paul increasingly viewed Yoko as the catalyst for their collapse. While he rarely attacked her directly in public, his interviews were filled with pointed references to outside influences and people who shouldn't have been in the studio. From Yoko's perspective, McCartney represented everything she was trying to pull John away from: commercial music, mainstream success, and artistic compromise. She made no secret of her disdain for Paul's work, dismissing his compositions as simple pop songs compared to John's artistic expressions. After Lennon's murder, the conflict between Paul and Yoko intensified over control of the Beatles' legacy. When McCartney requested that certain songs on which he was the primary writer be credited as McCartney-Lennon, instead of the traditional Lennon-McCartney, Yoko fiercely objected, seeing it as an attempt to diminish John's importance. The battle over song credits lasted for decades. Meanwhile, Yoko continued to shape John's posthumous image in ways that often positioned him in opposition to Paul. She even publicly voted for Paul as the least important Beatle in a Rolling Stone poll, a deliberate slight that cut deep. For McCartney, Yoko didn't just represent a difficult personality. She symbolized the theft of his closest creative partnership and continued to control his musical legacy long after John's death. Alan Klein, the manager who destroyed the Beatles. When Brian Epstein, the Beatles' beloved manager, died suddenly in 1967, the band was left adrift. They were musical geniuses, but business novices, suddenly responsible for an empire that included a record label, a film division, and a retail store, all losing money rapidly. Into this chaos stepped Alan Klein, a tough-talking American manager known for his ruthless negotiation tactics. Klein promised to sort out the Beatles' financial mess and secure them better deals than they'd ever had before. John Lennon was immediately impressed by Klein's straightforward approach, feeling that he talked to him like a normal human being rather than a Beatle to be manipulated. George Harrison and Ringo Starr soon followed John's lead, convinced by Klein's promises of financial salvation. Paul McCartney alone stood opposed. From their first meeting, he distrusted Klein completely. Every instinct told him not to trust this man, but his bandmates refused to listen to his warnings. Instead, Paul suggested the Beatles work with a different law firm, which only fueled suspicions that he was putting his personal interests above the band's. The result was unprecedented. 3 Beatles signed with Klein, while McCartney refused. The band was now effectively divided into 2 camps, with Klein driving the wedge deeper by portraying Paul as difficult and obstructionist. As Klein began restructuring their business empire, firing longtime employees and canceling projects, McCartney watched in horror as the company they had built was transformed. The situation became so intolerable that on December 31, 1970, McCartney took the nuclear option. He sued his own bandmates to dissolve the Beatles' partnership. The headlines were devastating, making Paul appear to be the man who killed the Beatles. He wasn't trying to end the band. He was trying to save them from Klein, but no one would listen. Time would prove McCartney right. By 1977, all 3 of his former bandmates had severed ties with Klein after discovering financial irregularities. Klein was eventually ordered to pay the Beatles a substantial sum and later served time in prison for tax evasion. John, George, and Ringo all eventually admitted that Paul had been right about Klein, but by then it was too late. The Beatles had dissolved, their relationships fractured beyond repair. For McCartney, this vindication brought little comfort. The band he loved had been destroyed, his reputation tarnished, and his warnings ignored until it was too late. Klein had turned them against each other at their most vulnerable moment, using their weaknesses against them until they couldn't even speak to each other anymore. Phil Spector and The Long and Winding Road. By early 1970, the Beatles were effectively finished, though the public didn't yet know it. Their final recording sessions had devolved into tense, unproductive arguments, leaving hours of unused recordings with no clear path forward. As a last-ditch effort to salvage something from these sessions, John Lennon and George Harrison brought in legendary producer Phil Spector to shape the raw recordings into a releasable album without consulting Paul. For McCartney, this decision was bad enough, but what followed was an act of musical vandalism that violated everything he believed in. Phil Spector was famous for his wall of sound production technique, creating dense, layered arrangements that were the polar opposite of the raw, back-to-basics approach Paul had envisioned. When Spector got his hands on McCartney's gentle ballad, The Long and Winding Road, he transformed it beyond recognition. Where Paul had recorded a simple, emotional piece centered on piano and vocals, Spector added an orchestra, a choir, and layers of strings that buried the song's intimate heart. Worse still, McCartney wasn't consulted about these changes. He first heard the Spector version when the finished album was presented to him shortly before release. Paul immediately sent a furious letter demanding that the orchestration be removed, but his plea was ignored. In May 1970, the album was released with Spector's heavy-handed production intact. For McCartney, this wasn't just an artistic disagreement, it was the ultimate betrayal of his musical vision. The song topped the American charts, but for Paul, it was a hollow victory. Every time he heard it on the radio, he was reminded of how his bandmates had allowed his creation to be mutilated. Spector remained unapologetic. dismissing McCartney as a lightweight and claiming that Paul had begged him to work with the Beatles. For over 30 years, McCartney lived with the pain of hearing his corrupted song become part of the Beatles' legacy. Finally, in 2003, he got his revenge with the release of a stripped-down version of the album that removed Spector's orchestrations and returned The Long and Winding Road to something closer to his original vision. But the wound never fully healed. For McCartney, the Spector incident represented everything he feared about losing control of his art, having his most personal expressions taken from him and distorted beyond recognition. Why McCartney kept silent? For decades, Paul McCartney has maintained a carefully crafted public image as the cheerful Beatle, the optimist, the gentleman of rock who rises above petty conflicts. But as we've seen, behind that smiling exterior lies a man who has carried deep wounds and lasting resentments. Why has he never publicly acknowledged this pain? Why maintain the facade when private hurt clearly lingers? The answer reveals much about both McCartney's character and the careful image management that has defined his career. First, there's the weight of the Beatles' legacy. The Fab Four aren't just a band. They're a cultural institution, a symbol of unity and love that transcends music. McCartney understands that if he were to publicly air his grievances, he wouldn't just be expressing personal pain. He'd be cracking the foundation of a myth that means everything to millions of fans worldwide. There's also the matter of McCartney's brand. In the decades since the Beatles' breakup, he has carefully cultivated an image as the consummate professional, the elder statesman of rock who rises above drama. This persona has served him well, helping him rebuild after the band's dissolution and establish one of the most successful solo careers in music history. To suddenly emerge as a bitter man nursing decades-old grudges would undermine everything he's built. The English cultural tradition of maintaining a stiff upper lip also plays a role. McCartney was raised in a post-war Liverpool environment where men were taught to bury their feelings, to handle conflicts privately rather than airing them publicly. This cultural programming runs deep, making public confrontation feel not just strategically unwise, but fundamentally wrong. Instead, McCartney has chosen a more subtle approach to expressing his resentments. His songs occasionally contain veiled references to those who've wronged him, and music has always been a safer outlet for pain than direct confrontation. As he's entered his later years, McCartney has increasingly embraced forgiveness, at least publicly, speaking warmly of John in interviews and maintaining civil relations with Yoko at Beatles-related events. What's clear is that McCartney has made a conscious choice to prioritize his art and his legacy over the momentary satisfaction of public vindication. By keeping his pain private, he ensures that when future generations think of Paul McCartney, they'll remember the music first, not the conflicts or betrayals. The wounds that shaped a legend. Every icon is shaped not just by their triumphs, but by their heartbreaks. For Paul McCartney, the betrayals and disappointments we've explored didn't just cause personal pain. They fundamentally influenced his art, his business decisions, and his approach to relationships for the rest of his life. After losing control of his Beatles catalog, McCartney became famously meticulous about business matters. The man who once signed contracts without reading them transformed into one of music's savviest businessmen, building a publishing empire and vigilantly protecting his creative rights. The pain of seeing The Long and Winding Road, transformed by Phil Spector, made McCartney insistent on maintaining complete creative control over his work. Perhaps most significantly, the fracturing of his relationship with John Lennon and the permanent loss of any chance for reconciliation created a melancholy undercurrent that runs through even McCartney's most optimistic work. These wounds haven't just shaped his career, they've influenced how he's approached new relationships, ensuring his closest personal relationship was also his closest professional one. There's a bittersweet irony in how these painful experiences contributed to McCartney's extraordinary longevity and success. The business lessons he learned helped him build and maintain his empire. The creative independence he insisted on allowed him to explore diverse musical directions across decades. Even his complicated grief over John has added depth and emotional resonance to his later work. As Paul McCartney enters his 9th decade, he continues to tour worldwide and release new music, maintaining his position as one of music's most beloved figures. The wounds he's carried may never fully heal, but they've become an integral part of the complex, multifaceted artist he is today. Perhaps that's why, despite the pain these relationships caused him, McCartney has chosen to keep his list private. He understands that these difficult experiences aren't separate from his legacy, they're an essential part of it.